Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and wow, it's been a while. I've been pretty busy the last couple of months, so there haven't been any updates. I'm sorry about that to the handful of you who actually watch what I put up. I appreciate you coming back. We're going to get back into reviewing some things, mainly because I have a bunch of new comics I got that I wanted to talk about. We're going to start with Punchline by Bill Williams and Matthew Weldon with guest pencils by, I'm going to have to check the name here real quick. Brian Denham. So, this is one of the Iconic Comics books. It's a pretty good book. I backed the Kickstarter for the second volume, which is Super Frenemies, and I got the catch-up perk so I could read the first volume too, because this is my first experience with the Punchline franchise, and I have a lot of thoughts about it. And I'm going to start with volume 1, and I'm going to do a review on volume 2 tomorrow. These two kind of go hand in hand because I have very split opinions on them, but we'll get into that. Let's start by just getting the form factor out of the way. This is a very typical square-bound trade paperback kind of a book. It's good quality. The pages are nice and glossy, and I have nothing bad to say about it. It's good presentation. It doesn't do any weird gimmicks like with a reverse cover like we saw with Black Ops 2 or a foil slash chromium cover like we saw with Common America. And frankly, I prefer it that way. This feels like a really good book. The cover feels nice in the hand. The pages are great, and that's really all I would ask for. So from here on out, when I talk about Iconic Comics books, assuming they continue to be of this quality, I really don't intend to talk about the form factor a whole lot because it's perfect the way it is. Again, I'm not a huge fan of these gimmick constructions or covers. Basically, the only upgrade that I would really go out of my way for is a hardback. And while I would like that for Punchline at the very least, it was not available. So, I consider the form factor on this book to be about as good as it can be. Let's talk about the art. Matthew Weldon is a great artist. I think early in this book, he was still working out some of his storytelling skills, his ability to show the story progressing from panel to panel in ways that make sense. And you can kind of see that here on this page in this bottom panel. Well, going from this panel here, the second to last panel on the page, to this panel here, this character, Mel's arm, looks very odd. You know, in this shot, it's clearly basically being held out in front of her, kind of in her lap. And then in this shot, suddenly it's behind this armrest on the bench they're sitting on. And that was really jarring the first time I saw it. It didn't make a whole lot of sense how we got that transition. And I don't know what happened there, but there are occasional small continuity errors like that in the first chapter or two, and it feels just like Weldon was getting used to. I don't know if this is Matt Weldon's first comic, or if he was some other kind of artist beforehand. I don't know any of his biography there, but it just feels like he was kind of working his way into this particular take on illustration. And that's okay. I didn't really notice any issues like that after really the first couple of chapters. Here's another example on the very next page. This looks almost like Jessie is about to stab herself in the throat with her pencil. Again, it's just a little composition thing. There aren't a whole lot of them, and they're pretty much gone after about 30 or 40 pages. So it's not a real issue. By the same token, in some of these action poses or dynamic poses, what really should be when we have Versema, this is Jessie's superhero avatar, they look a little stiff. Again, in the first 2 or 3 chapters, 40 to 60 pages, they don't always come out looking quite as dynamic as I would hope them to be. There's another example of that. Here again, this page just looks a little stiff and a little static, and I would like to see a little bit more action in those pages, but again, this is only a problem for the first half of the book, and even then only occasionally. So these are very small nitpicks, but they are things that are worth pointing out. Another thing worth pointing out is there is some cases of anime face or overdone reactions. You can see a pretty good example here. She has kind of that brainless face moment. Personally, I don't mind these. I know some people really hate them in their comics, especially a comic that is as realistically drawn as Punchline is. But they're there, and that's an artistic thing to consider. So all in all, pretty good art. Actually, really great art with a couple of early lapses. And again, these are gone by about halfway through the book. And if you get to volume 2, just a little spoiler, they're gone entirely. I think by that point, Weldon is on top of his game as far as comic storytelling goes. I do want to talk a little bit about the costume design because Versema is the central superhero of Punchline. Her costume bears a little bit of analysis because it is something you're going to see a lot, and it's a pretty good costume design. There are parts of it that I really, really like, and there are parts of it that I think are significant drawbacks. And that's actually how I feel about most of Volume 1. But let's just talk about the costume right now. So our hero's name is Versema, and she has this really nice white, black, and orange color scheme to her. I can't think of any other superhero I've seen with that color scheme. So it's unique in that respect, and it's very striking. It's very bold. There's the strong contrast between all three colors, and the orange is bright and catches the eye, along with the white, and then the black gives strength and definition to the costume. I like these V patterns on her chest and on her arms, and that kind of ties into her name without being like an S shield or some kind of symbol somewhere on her costume. So that's also a nice touch. I like the asymmetry. This thigh cutout is very striking and very distinctive. Again, it gives her a very unique coloration, a very unique suit construction. I imagine this would be a bear to cosplay, but it's a very fun costume design. I have two big problems with it. The first is the cape. So you can't see it in this shot, but her cape is kind of cut out in an M pattern. Again, that kind of ties nicely into her name. Here's a good shot of it from the back. You can kind of see it right there. Well, it's not a good shot. It's very small. Here's again. So it's got the V on it, and then when you combine it with the tails, it kind of makes an M as well. Again, that's really nice because it ties into her name, Versema, VM. Those are the strongest consonant sounds in the name. So that's nice, but it also kind of, since she has this very busy midsection, it kind of makes that look cluttered because it also has the cape. And I really think the cape would have been better if it was at least knee length and maybe ankle length down here at the tips, and it would have been less busy. So I would like to see a longer cape. Personally, I think that would make the design read better, especially in some action scenes in this book. The other thing is the shades. And I know shades are cool and you can do a lot with them, but especially on a page, a panel on a page, and that's a terrible example, they just tend to make Versema look bug-eyed a lot of the time, like you see here. It blocks off her expression. We can't see her eyes. It looks very unnatural. She can't emote through them. I mean, sometimes we get to see her eyes through them, like we see down on the bottom here. But a lot of the time, when she is at a distance like this, or in the middle of an action scene, we just lose her expression, and it doesn't look good. Now, if these were wraparound shades instead of these big honking 70s style glasses that we have here, you might be able to get away with transferring the expression to the shades, especially since we are sometimes in this book more malleable with her expression. And if Versema ever gets a costume update, that would be nice to see, just so we can get more of her expression. As it is, I don't like the sunglasses on Versema. Um, they just they don't work. Uh, so all in all, very strong design with a couple of gripes with it. Um, Now you may be thinking Jesse's superhero alter ego is named Versema, so why is the title of this comic book Punchline? I don't know. Um, I just don't know. It's not explained in this volume. It's not explained in volume 2. Other than the fact that Versema punches things a lot, I don't see a huge connection between the title and the rest of the story. And that's kind of just my way of segueing into the rest of the story, other than to say, I'm not a huge fan of not understanding the title. I like titles to tie in a little more clearly than that. But hey, it's a title and it's catchy. So what is the story about? Well, the story is about the relationship, primarily the relationship between Jessie, who is a new superhero who gets her powers from Mel, who is an old superhero, and I mean an old superhero. I believe we're told in here that Mel is 106 years old. Their superpowers are magically based, and apparently one of the magic powers you get is you don't age, and that's neat. Except you also are apparently supposed to pass your powers down eventually, and Mel gets in trouble because she doesn't, and she almost gets offed, and Jessie says, well, I'll take your powers because the people who have given Mel her powers are basically withholding them until she passes them on. And so Jessie takes them, and then Mel is able to recover from a wound that was apparently being prevented from recovering. And okay, fair enough. There's a lot to unpack there. And unfortunately, Volume 1 of Punchline doesn't unpack any of it for you. Now, you could say that they are expecting their readers to be intelligent enough to unpack it all on their own, and that's fine for the most part. My big problem, well, let's delve a little bit deeper into the rest of the story. So, Jessie gets her powers, and then she undergoes some training with Mel, and I actually really like the training sequence. I think it kind of shows the expectations that Mel has, and some of the hurdles that Versema has to overcome as a new hero. Mel gives her this relay thing where she has to go over to a cell tower and pull ribbons off of it, and then come back and go. And it's an endurance training, it's a speed training, it's getting used to your powers kind of training. Pretty good. It just takes up a few pages, so it never overstays its welcome. And then Versema goes and she takes out a robber, and Mel then, well, she doesn't take out a robber, she takes out the robber's minions, while Mel ambushes the robber and murders him. This is important because it sets up the major conflict for this story. And that conflict is between Mel, who has a very dark side to her. She has a lot of baggage from all the time she spent as a hero, and she has a very cynical worldview. And Jessie slash Versema, who is a much more optimistic person, she wants to do a lot more building up and encouraging of people, and that's fine. So there is going to be conflict between these two eventually, but since Versema doesn't know that Mel has murdered someone yet, they continue to work and train together for most of this volume. Eventually, a small breach of trust through the training process causes Versema slash Jessie to doubt Mel's leadership, and that leads to her talking to a member of the FBI who reveals that this robber was murdered at the site of this crime that Versema broke up. And that boils down to a break between Jessie and Mel, and that's the end of Volume 1. There's a lot of really good stuff in here. The interpersonal conflict between Mel and Versema slash Jessie is very strong. You get a very good idea of who Mel is and what being a superhero has cost her over the course of her long life, you get a decent idea of who Jessie is in this first volume. Although I think she doesn't really get fleshed out until volume 2, I would feel. Um, and the conflict between them is understandable, but it has a couple of weaknesses to it that really made it hard for me to get invested. And the first weakness is we don't really know anything about Mel or Jessie outside of their relationship to each other. And this is a brand new relationship. Mel and Jessie are not friends of old standing. They meet for the first time in a graveyard on Christmas Eve, and they've gone their separate ways by, I believe, early February of the next year. So they know each other for, let's call it, a month and a half. And there's not a lot of weight to that relationship. The fact that they have a falling out and they go their separate ways is interesting, but it doesn't feel like a real consequence for either of them. They're not heavily invested in each other. Technically, Mel is invested in Jessie because Jessie is now the holder of her superpowers, but we don't know a whole lot about those superpowers. We don't know how Mel got them. We don't know what the stakes to them are. We don't know any of that. So that doesn't really feel that consequential either. Mel clearly feels very strongly about her calling and what she did with her powers, but that's the extent of it. And, you know, now that it's very hard to get real invested in that when we only see her as a retired hero, essentially. On the flip side of the coin, we don't know enough about Jessie, about her situation, about her family, about her life outside of being Versema, to really know what stepping away from that role would cost her. So this conflict that boils up between the two, it just lacks weight because we don't have a feeling for the consequences if it can't be resolved. Furthermore, it happens in the first volume. And really, you cannot credibly change your status quo until you've established a status quo. We don't have a status quo for either of these characters, so if there is a change to their status quo, it doesn't have a whole lot of meaning, and if it doesn't bounce back to how it was before the change, you know, what I'm trying to say is I had a hard time believing this could be a permanent break, just because there was so much unanswered that Mel and Jessie could only answer for each other. So I knew, even though at the end of this volume, Versema and Mel had gone their separate ways, I knew they were going to have to come back together and do it very quickly. And indeed, they come back together in the very next issue. So I feel like that entire story arc was poorly executed. What I would have liked to see is the breakup between the two pushed out a bit. Based on what I've seen, I think it would have come sometime in volume 3, ideally, if I were writing this, just so we have some time to get more invested in these characters, more of an idea of what the relationship between them means, an idea of what Mel's powers are and why they mean so much to her, and what the great bigger picture behind them is, because we know from fairly early on there is kind of a bigger picture between them. But without that kind of a context, without knowing about more about Jessie's family, whether she likes her parents, whether she hates her parents. We learned that her brother died of a drug overdose in this volume, but she also seems to have already resolved that emotional trauma, and Jessie really doesn't have a desire to go after the dealers who sold him the drugs he OD'd on. And In fact, that's one of the things that builds to the breach of trust between Mel and Jesse, because Mel tries to push her to go after this gang. Um, you know, that's not enough to give us an idea of what retiring is going to cost Jesse, or just breaking with Mel is going to cost Jesse. So all of that is very fuzzy. And honestly, if this was all I had to base my opinion of Punchline on, I would have stopped reading with this volume, because I really felt like the story was not giving me the context I needed to really get invested in these characters. So I want to be fair to this story and say that after reading the second volume, I am at least invested enough to buy volume 3. So it does improve from here. But I feel like this was a pretty weak first volume, because it tried to do a really big and emotionally demanding story arc without really letting us get comfortable enough with our main characters to really invest in that emotional story arc. And like I said before, I think at least half of this story would have been better pushed off until the third volume. But it's been told now, and really the writing and the dialogue and the ideas are pretty good. A lot of the side stuff is great, fun action stuff. After this punch out with the robber, Versema meets Beetle Girl, who is a superhero down the coast, I believe. And they take out a giant goat man with an axe, and there's the advertised punching and a lot of swashbuckling action adventure type stuff, some using your head stuff. Versema is the muscle, Mel is very much the brains. She plays things very much like a super spy. All of that is quite good. I just feel like this storyline came too early in Punchline's run. And full credit to Bill Williams, who is the writer. He does manage to ground his characters very well later on. And I think that this will turn into something that I really want to stick with. I just feel like Volume 1 is a little bit weak. But those are my thoughts on Punchline Volume 1, Blood Sisters, as they call it. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, there's a like button and a subscribe button down below. You can use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.